afterwards we're going to have a group picture, so no one run off.
Okay, very good.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Delta State University and the Agora Club here at Delta State. The Agora Club is a club that's dedicated to raising the consciousness level of students and the community as well. And Margaret Block here, who sits on the panel, is one of my good friends, and she always introduces me to the nicest people who have a lot of information that they can share. And so she just afforded us the opportunity to have these historians and political activists here on campus with us to talk about and to have an intergenerational dialogue on politics, policy, and problems in American development from an historical perspective. So on behalf of the university, welcome.
On behalf of the Agora Club and the Catholic High Chapter of Delta Sigma Theta, we would like to welcome you to the Public Forum for History and Politics here at Delta State University. We hope everyone you enjoy.
All right, thank you so much for the kind welcome to your wonderful campus. And I just want to thank Arlene for organizing and kind of putting us up and putting up with us as well. This is a great opportunity for us, obviously. I feel very honored personally to be here with some wonderful colleagues who I am going to introduce in a moment. I thought I should tell you how we ended up kind of getting here. My name is Paul Ortiz. I'm the director of the Oral History Program at the University of Florida. As my colleague Margaret says, whenever you say Florida, you have to say, "Go Gators." I won't say that tonight. I guess I already did. But each year, actually after the last 2 years, we have taken a team of graduates and undergraduates from the University of Florida to the Mississippi Delta to do oral histories with the Sunflower County Civil Rights Organization. So this is how we really originally got here, was through the kind sponsorship of folks in the Sunflower County Civil Rights Organization. And then Margaret Block brought us over to Cleveland. She said, the folks in Indianola say Cleveland is this country place. It really is this great place. And so we just say, hey, we'll come over to Cleveland, right? So anyway, that's why we're in Cleveland this year. My colleagues in the panel were all kind of mutual conspirators. Anytime we have a chance to get people in trouble, we'll do it. So we're here tonight really to talk about kind of cutting edge scholarship along the lines of what Arlene was saying, trying to get talking about policy issues and the civil rights movement and the Black freedom struggle as a way to think about contemporary and historical political issues and problems in the United States. Each of my colleagues has had a long and distinguished history in activism and in scholarship. And what I'm going to do this evening is just briefly introduce them in the order that they're going to speak and just kind of let them go. And at the end, the goal will be to get to a conversation, a dialogue, a chance for us to ask each other questions and to just kind of talk. So I'm going to start at the beginning with my colleague, Dr. Hasan Jeffries. He is a professor in history at the Ohio State University. He has just published a book. He may be the only person who actually brought his book, so I'll go ahead and take the liberty of passing it around. But it's titled Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt, just published, hot off the presses, NYU Press. The next colleague that you're going to hear from is Professor Emilye Crosby. She teaches at State University of New York, Geneseo. She is the author of an amazing book in the civil rights movement titled A Little Taste of Freedom, The Black Freedom Struggle in Claiborne County. And she's going to go second. Number 3 is a UF undergraduate. Khambria Clarke. She's a history major. This is her second trip to the Delta with the oral history program. We had a major Black history program at the University of Florida last March 17th. Khambria recited almost in its entirety James Weldon Johnson's famous poem, 50 Years. And those of you history majors know that this was a poem that James Weldon Johnson wrote about the emancipation or the abolition of slavery. And so Khambria is going to actually be reading a paper from another colleague of ours who really dearly wanted to be here who couldn't make it. That is Zoharah Simmons, or Gwendolyn Simmons. Gwendolyn Simmons was the head of the SNCC project in, I'm going to block this now, in Laurel, Mississippi, for 18 months. And then after Laurel, she worked with SNCC in Atlanta and other places as well. But Khambria is going to read her presentation. Number 4, batting cleanup, if you will, Margaret, legendary activist from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She's a person who is a historian in her own right. And today she took our team around to different civil rights sites in the county, in the area, and she's a tremendous educator. We feel really honored to have her with us today. Our 5th presenter just drove up from Hattiesburg, right?
Yeah.
From the University of Southern Mississippi. I should say everyone here traveled a lot. Oh, you did bring your book?
I wrote one.
Okay. Fair use, you can pass it around. Professor Austin, of course, teaches at the University of Southern Mississippi. He's the author of Up Against the Wall, Violence in the Making and Unmaking of the Black Panther Party. And so without further delay, Dr. Jeffries.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and thank you all for coming this evening. It's wonderful to be here and to be in this space with you all, and also to share this panel with so many distinguished folk, including our up-and-coming scholar, Ms. Khambria Clarke. What I want to talk about today, just for a few minutes, and I'm assuming we have maybe 5 or 10 minutes, 5 or so minutes each, is this question of politics, policy, and problems, contemporary politics, policy, and problems, but viewed from an historical perspective. As Paul mentioned, I just published a book entitled Bloody Lowndes, Civil Rights and Black Power in Alabama's Black Belt. And I want to talk a little bit about that as it relates to these 3 issues of politics, policy, and problems. Because the way in which African Americans in this rural county in Alabama in 1965 addressed this problem, or addressed the many problems that they faced, was through politics in an effort to change policy. Let me explain what I mean this way. At the beginning of 1965 in this county in Alabama, which is sandwiched between Montgomery and Selma, it's the county where 45 miles of the march from the famous Selma to Montgomery march go through this county. It's a county much like many counties in the Delta, the Mississippi Delta. It was 80% African American. But at the start of 1965, in this 80% African American county, there were precisely 0 registered voters. They called this county Bloody Lowndes because of the long legacy of white racial violence and racial terrorism in this county. A terrorism and a kind of violence that was so vicious that it created an atmosphere of fear and intimidation dating back to the era of slavery, and that carried forward 100 years. So in 1965, 0 registered voters. Well, 18 months later, that same county that had 0 registered voters not only had registered, 18 months later, not only had registered a majority of the African Americans in that county, but they had created their own independent political party, the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, that chose as its symbol a snarling Black Panther, from which the Black Panther logo and the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, that so many of us are familiar with, took its logo and, to a certain extent, a measure of inspiration from what was happening down in this rural county in Alabama. So as I approached this topic of politics, policy, and problems, I thought about the book and what happened in Lowndes County, Alabama, and I wanted to share just a word about the way in which these ordinary, everyday people, working together with SNCC activists, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists, the organization that Ms. Block worked with and worked tirelessly with for so long, helped transform this county. The way in which they sought to address this question of absolute disenfranchisement, extreme poverty, complete segregated education. 10 years after Brown, not a single black child attended school with a single white child in 1965. This question of extreme violence and absolute, again, political exclusion. In 1965, following on the heels of the incredible effort of black Mississippians, African Americans in Mississippi, and the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party challenge at Atlantic City, the failure to win recognition of that party led many within SNCC to say, we are not going, it's the end of 1964, we are no longer going to work within or under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. They said that this is not just a moral problem that America is facing, this problem of segregation and white supremacy. It's partly a political problem. And as a political problem, it needs political solutions. And for so long, at least in that early part of the 60s, for some, they saw the political solutions coming from working with inside the Democratic Party, even in the South. Well, for some, after the MFDP Atlantic City challenge, after the failure to win that recognition, they say the Democratic Party is as corrupt as nationally as the state Democratic parties and these local Democratic parties that had embraced segregation for so long. So Stokely Carmichael and many within SNCC said, we are going to operate, we are going to create political parties, political power by working outside of the Democratic Party. And so they zero in on Lowndes County, Alabama, and say, if we can help organize Lowndes County, Alabama, in the heart of the Alabama Black Belt with this long tradition of violence, then we can, that will be the domino that starts the chain reaction to break down segregation and white supremacy and white violence, not only in the Alabama Black Belt, but throughout the South. And so in the beginning of 1965, a handful of SNCC organizers, led by Stokely Carmichael, Kwame he hadn't changed his name yet, and they begin to organize. They begin to talk to people. They begin to knock on doors. And they don't do it by themselves. There were local people who have been born and raised in Lowndes County, as there are local people everywhere, who were ready to move and had already begun to move. But what SNCC organizers bring in is a certain political expertise and organizing expertise. They weren't simply fearless because they had fear, but they brought in an expertise that could be used at that moment in time that many local people simply didn't have. So it was and they learned, so local people are able to learn from these SNCC organizers who bring in this expertise, but Stokely Carmichael and the other organizers who move in talk constantly about how much they're learning from local people. So it is a mutual relationship, not only of respect, but also of education. So SNCC organizers are bringing in this expertise, and the expertise is, what are the laws that would allow for the creation of a political party? What are the laws that keep people from registering to vote? What can an elected official actually do? And what can he or she not do? And so they bring that to the table. And through this process of conversation, through this process of dialogue, local people filtering their experiences, trying to fight power in 1965, filtering those experiences through their life experiences, reached the conclusion independently that the problems that we face do in fact, or do require, to a certain extent, political solutions. And that these political solutions mean creating new policy changes, the way government operates. And they concluded that working within the Democratic Party, working with white Democrats at that moment in time, who embraced segregation fully and completely, as one local person said, why it didn't make any sense for me to join the Democratic Party when these were the people who have been beating our heads and killing us all these years. And so they say, you know what, you are onto something, SNCC, you are onto something, Stokely Carmichael. If we want power, If we want to gain the power that is necessary to create the new policies to effect change, we have to do it on our own. And so they create by knocking on doors, the same way they create the movement, that by knocking on doors, not just to register voters, which they do first, but to organize and create an independent political party. And so within that 18-month period, not only do they register voters, but they rally support behind 7 African-American candidates on this Black Panther ballot symbol, running under the Black Panther ballot symbol in 1966 for the 7 positions in the county courthouse. So they run a black sheriff, an African-American for sheriff, for coroner, for school board, for tax collector and tax assessor. They say, we want to create the policy to tax the rich to feed the poor, to have a sheriff that will actually enforce the law and not brutalize people, to have a coroner that is willing to call a murder and not just a death for causes that are unknown. That if we're going to make that kind of change that will affect our daily lives, then we have to take over the courthouse, and we have to do it with these individuals. And it wasn't anything special about the people who run. They had to overcome their fear, yes, but they were ordinary people who simply said it's time to make a change. And so these 7 folk run for office. Now, if I tell you what happens, you may not get the book.
And you gotta get the book.
And you gotta get the book. But I'll leave it at that. But we can talk about sort of what happens. But the point is this. They understood the political problem. And it wasn't simply that they were disenfranchised. They said the political problem is that we don't have the power to create the kind of proper policies that will dramatically change society. So they said it's not enough simply to have the vote. We have to use the vote to put people into office that will then create the kind of change that we need. That's something that is not only applicable to 1965 and 1966, but something that is applicable to 2009. It's not enough to put faces in office, whether that is a familiar or friendly face in office, whether that's in the White House or in the courthouse. It's incumbent upon the people who support those candidates to hold them accountable, to say you are now beholden to the people and the people's interests because it's the people who put you into office. That was at the core of what they did in 1965 and 66, and that was the essence of what they meant by Black Power. And that is still something that resonates and is an important lesson for us to keep in mind and bear in mind 10 years into the new century, and even with an African American in the White House. So I'll just stop there and pass the baton on to Kwame or Emilye. Thank you.
I'd also like to thank everyone for making this possible and being here today, and it's always good to be here with my friends. But one of my friends who's not here said that you should never follow Hasan Jeffries on a panel, and I think that she was right. I'm not sure, Paul, what I did to offend you, that you put me in this position. But as Paul mentioned, I wrote a book about Claiborne County, Mississippi, and that's where I grew up. And I teach now in upstate New York. And Claiborne County, Mississippi is a community that's about 80% African American, and the institution I teach at is about 95% white. And so these are very different contexts in some ways. And for me, it's sort of interesting to be in these two different places and think a little bit about them. One of the things that I learned in studying Claiborne County, so this is a community I grew up in, and then I came back and looked at it as a historian. And I found that it gave me a little bit of a different perspective on things, and I started to see some of the pieces and see some of the connections, and it became a little easier to make visible some of what I saw around me in a contemporary period, to see the stages that things had gone through previously. Hasan talked about Lowndes County and how violent Lowndes County was, and the complete disfranchisement of African Americans, and the ways that that also impacted public policy. Claiborne County, Mississippi had a reputation for being more of a paternalistic kind of place, where that was the preferred way of controlling, quote, controlling African Americans rather than outright violence. But there was still pretty, across the board disfranchisement. In 1965, when the Voting Rights Act passed, I think about 20 African Americans were registered to vote in the county. About 5 months later, that was about 2,000 and the majority of the population. So you have a very rapid transition in terms of the number of registered voters after this legislation. But one of the things that African Americans in Claiborne County confronted is the same issue that folks in Lowndes did, is how do you take this vote and make it meaningful in terms of people's daily lives? The way people did that in Claiborne County was somewhat different than in Lowndes. But one of the things that you see is a real difficulty of translating that vote, at least in the short term, maybe in the long term, into the kinds of quality of life improvements that people were looking for. And part of that story is the sort of tenacious white resistance and how persistent it was. And in some ways, how it cost whites in many ways, as well as African Americans. And so the schools were segregated before the movement. What did you say, 10 years after Brown? 10 years after Brown in Claiborne County, it was just as segregated, pretty much across the board, right? But the schools today in Port Gibson are still segregated, and none of the schools that students go to, white or black, are as good as people would like for them to be. But anyway, so when I teach in New York, my students think that race is just a Mississippi problem or just a Southern problem. And then they also show that they don't really know much of the history. I think a lot of us don't know enough of the history. That's sort of one of my things. But so they'll say, well, why didn't blacks vote for sympathetic whites? Not understanding even the extent to which disfranchisement worked. And so, we work with that in class. But one of the things is that they don't realize that they go to segregated schools too. They think they go to integrated schools until you start asking them what their schools look like. And then they go, oh, those schools are segregated too. So I don't want to take up a whole lot of time because I'm hoping that we can have some conversation. But I think that really in order to address our, some of the contemporary problems that we're confronting, whether it's the quality of education, whether it's healthcare, that we need to understand our history, and particularly for me, the role that race has played in creating some of these problems, but also that we have very good models for positive potential that we don't look at either. And I think Mound Bayou, for example, John Dittmer has a new book called The Good Doctors that describes the early public health clinic in Mound Bayou, which seems like an absolutely wonderful model for dealing with healthcare. Child Development Group of Mississippi from this area, and the citizenship schools provide wonderful models for quality education. And the Lowndes County Freedom Organization in Lowndes County provides a wonderful model for engaged citizenship. So I think that we need to look at the history, both to understand how it's helped shape and create the problems we confront today, but also for some models that can be really useful in grappling with some of these problems.
Hi, good evening, everyone. And of course, these are the words of Dr. Gwendolyn Zoharah Simmons. I want to apologize to the panelists and all of you gathered here this evening for not being present for what I know will be an incredible exchange between the panelists and the friends and colleagues who have gathered for this event. Thanks to my colleague Paul Ortiz, director of the University of Florida's Samuel Proctor Oil History Project, and to his collaborator in organizing these activities, Margaret Block, and to Arlene Sanders from Delta State for organizing this event. Not being here with you tonight is my great loss. I so wanted to attend this event as I have not been to the Mississippi Delta since the 1960s. During the 60s, I was Mississippi field staff during the 1964 summer project, and for 14 months beyond when I was project director in Laurel, Mississippi. Later, as a staff person for the National Council of Negro Women, I visited the area with Ms. Hamer, who was also staff with the NCNW. I later returned to Mississippi in the 1970s as staff with the American Friends Service Committee when I served as the Associate Director for its program on government surveillance and citizens' rights. This project was investigating the role of the FBI, the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, sheriff's offices, and police departments that work to undermine the civil rights and peace movement in Mississippi and across the country. I have returned to the state to attend SNCC and COFO reunions, but did not get to the Delta on these occasions. Therefore, I am terribly disappointed that I am not here with you this evening. Initially, Paul had said our panel would focus on the civil rights and Black Power legacies that many of you in Mississippi were such an integral part of. Therefore, I will begin with some reflections on the legacies of these movements and their impact on the nation today. It is always important to recount the long and arduous history we African Americans have had since we were brought here against our will to these shores. All too often, Americans want to sweep this history under the rug, telling blacks to forget it and to move on. I reject such thinking, as African American history and our struggles to force this nation to live up to its principles are too critical to ever be forgotten or to be pushed under the rug. From the earliest times, we demanded that this nation live up to the vaunted language of its founding documents, but to no avail until the 20th century's civil rights and Black Power movements. The history and legacy of African Americans who have played such a key, albeit unacknowledged role in the creation of this nation must be remembered and learned from. As you know, during the Atlantic slave trade, Africans as property as well as their labor were counted as a large part of the actual wealth of this nation for 252 years, from 1607 until 1865, and provided the basis for it. They also provided a substantial portion of the capital for this country's industrial revolution and enabled the United States to project its power into the rest of the world. Of course, their bodies and labor produced the vast fortunes for many of the individual white Americans who would become the titans of industry and commerce in this country. The preservation and passing on of the signature role of African Americans in the creation of this nation is one of my prime objectives as a teacher and social activist. This is why I am pleased to have been involved for the last 8 years in teaching some of the incredible history in both my African American religion and my race, religion, and rebellion courses, where we study the history through the lens of religion, one of the most important, if not the most important institution in the life of African American populations during our long and difficult sojourn here in the Americas. Consistently, my students ask me why they had never learned of such things they are learning in these classes before. These are students of all races. I've had students say that they had no idea how brutal slavery was, as they thought it was basically a benign system. Recently, several students told me that they had no idea that black men fought in the Union Army during the Civil War, and they were more than shocked to learn that it is quite likely that the North would have lost the war had it not been for black Union troops. As an older black American, born in the Jim Crow South, who suffered the indignities of that system in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was my great privilege to serve on the front lines of the historic civil rights and Black Power movements of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, and to live to see our nation, particularly here in the South, go from being an apartheid state for African Americans to one in which an African American man could become president of this nation, and it is indeed a wonderful event. We must never let the nation forget that what the civil rights movement did for the nation as well as for blacks and other folks of color. The southern U.S. was an apartheid state, and the phenomenal rise in population and wealth in the South in the last 25 years would never have occurred if the civil rights movement had not ended apartheid here. People of color from all over the world have moved here to the South and have flourished. It is the civil rights movement that made such immigration flourishing possible. I, like many black Americans, never thought that I would live to see the day when a black man would be elected to the presidency of the United States. I, like a majority of Americans of all races and ethnic backgrounds, am overjoyed to see that a substantial number of white Americans have overcome that deep and pervasive racism that made many unable to see beyond the color of a person's skin in judging that person's character, their qualifications for a job, an elected office, a position on a board or a committee, and the like. A significant percentage of white Americans, approximately 30%, have made a huge leap forward in their consciousness by deciding that they could pull the voting lever for a black man to become president of the United States on the basis of his talents and qualifications and not his race. As we know, many on the right are terribly unhappy about this reality, but large numbers of our diverse citizenry are supportive of the president, and equally startling, are able to embrace not only him, but his wife Michelle and their 2 children as the First Lady and first children of our nation. This is earth-shattering not only for us here in America, but for people around the world who are viewing this process in great amazement. It is important to remember that many people around the world thought that America was a white country. I know this from firsthand experience during my travels around the world. I recall once, while living in Jordan in the Middle East, being told that I could not be an American, as all Americans are white. Crazy, right? I pulled out my passport and showed it to this particular lady, who gasped in shock. I wonder what this lady and those like her think now. As I stated, this is not something I thought that I would live to see, and I am most happy to see it. At the same time, I am not amongst those who think that the election of Barack Obama as the 44th President of the United States is an indication that we have suddenly become a post-racial America. This, in my view, is far from the reality. While many Americans, particularly persons of color, knew that America had not overcome its 4 centuries-old legacy of racism overnight, the recent arrest of the esteemed Harvard professor Henry Louis Gates at his home for disorderly conduct momentarily put race back on the national agenda. Peniel E. Joseph, who has written an excellent book on Black Power, recently penned a perceptive article regarding the Gates arrest titled Our National Post-Racial Hangover. In it, he reminds us that since Americans' racial disparities remain as deep-rooted after Barack Obama's election as they were before, it was only a matter of time until the myth of post-racism exploded in our collective national face. He sees the Gates arrest as a metaphor for the national legacy of racial discrimination. Also, some of the social commentators see a racist undertone behind all of the hysteria over healthcare reform. As you know, a number of these town hall meetings have turned into shouting and shoving matches, with people screaming all kinds of ridiculous charges against the president. He is being accused of planning to have all elderly people euthanized and other madness. As an example of the racism that can so easily be stirred up at these events, an example of this occurred in Missouri at one of Senator Claire McCaskill's health care town hall meetings last week. Possibly you saw that event on the news where 2 Black women were being hustled out of a town hall meeting rather forcefully by white policemen or security guards. Initially, the news reported that these women had displayed signs in the meeting that this was not allowed and that this was why they were being forced out. Thank goodness for an investigative reporter who dug deeper and discovered video footage that showed what really happened. He posted the complete footage of the altercation on YouTube, where I saw it. As it turns out, these women were not holding up their signs, but had them rolled up lying on a chair. The posters had a picture of Rosa Parks on them. A white man can be seen walking over to the women who were seating, snatching the posters and tearing them up. When the women protested, they were immediately surrounded by police and hustled very forcefully out of the room. The majority white audience whistled and cheered as the women were pushed out. This same reporter found footage showing several white men at that same meeting who held up signs inside the hall, and when the police went over to talk with them, they seemingly agreed that these men had the rights to brandish their signs and were not thrown out, nor were they forced to put their signs away. This is a double standard, and nothing was done about it. This was another incident that makes it clear to me that racism continues to be alive and well in our country, unfortunately, and it manifests itself in many and varied ways. Should I try to wrap it up? While I do think that the presidency of Barack Obama will serve as a partial anecdote to the negative stereotyping of African Americans as innately inferior, which still persists in some quarters, it will not change the conditions noted above without social movements arising that will put pressure on our national, state, and local governments to institute the changes needed to reverse these deadly trends. As President Obama says himself, he cannot bring about the change so desperately needed to this country alone. It will take progressive social movements and people across the racial and economic spectrum to bring about the changes so urgently needed if America is to become what America never was, a racially, sexually, and economically just nation where all persons have the same opportunities and life chances. We still need robust and vigorous movements for social change. We cannot be lulled into thinking that with a Black man in office, even a good one, that we can rest on our laurels and do nothing. The struggle continues. For every step forward that we make, there are those forces of repression trying to push us backwards. We cannot let this happen. If there is one thing that we must learn about American history, it is that every right we enjoy today is that egalitarian and progressive is the result of struggle. Every right that is egalitarian and progressive is the result of struggle. Yes, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution provided the theoretical tools upon which we based our struggles, but everything from the 35-hour week to African Americans having their civil rights enforced by the law of the land, to women having their civil rights and human rights, came about through struggle. People, men, women, and children, fought and died for these rights. Some of you in this room tonight fought and were brutalized for Blacks, workers, and women to have these rights. The blood of our martyrs will soak this ground on which we stand. They died for these rights. Let us march on till victory, a victory of freedom, justice, a living wage for all, universal health care, and for all, and dignity for all is one. Thank you.
I have to stand up because I'm a poet, and I told Paul, you never invite a poet to be on a panel. And I'm going to dedicate this poem to one of my friends, Robert Earl Brown, and it's called Justice and Jive, and then I get to a little bit of what I'm going to talk about. And it's called Justice and Jive. It's a history poem of American justice. Justice wasn't in America's plan when they took away the Indian nation's land, like the Arapaho, the Apache, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Navajo, and many more. Was it a just plan when you banished them to a desolate land and infected them with smallpox and hives? You just knew that they wouldn't survive. These injustices can never be justified. You call it justice, but it's just another word for jive. Where was justice when slavery abound? Perhaps she was helping old master keep Swobo's nose to the ground. They took away his children, his culture, his language, and his identity, but they could not take his dignity. Madam Justice, you can't hide. We charge you with genocide. You call it justice, but it's just another word for jive. Justice was nowhere around when all of the lynchings were going down. The Klan strung us up and didn't try to hide because they knew that justice wasn't on our side. When Billie Holiday sang Strange Fruit, she was singing about dead bodies swinging from a poplar tree. She could have been singing about you or me. Billie knew that justice would never preside. You call it justice, but Billie called it jive. Justice comes with a dollar sign. Although justice is supposed to be blind, I can't buy justice and pay my rent. I make minimum wage with no benefits. It seems to me that justice is only for the rich. If you don't have money, justice will be denied. You call it justice, but it's just another word for jive. Justice must be colorblind. If justice is really colorblind, then why are so many black and brown brothers doing time? You locked them up on some homemade facts, but that was always your plan of attack. Langston Hughes once said that justice is a blind goddess to whom we blacks are wise. Her bandage covers two festering sores that once perhaps were eyes. You call it justice, but Langston called it jive. Madame Justice must be really tired. She's permitting the cops to do black profiles. They watch us and stop us for no good reasons. We feel like sitting ducks during hunting season. It's about time for justice to be on our side. But you call it justice, but it's just another word for jive. Mr. President, this was Bush at the time. Mr. President, if justice is really intact, then why did you create the Patriots Act? Your homeland security is an injustice in disguise. But Mr. Bush, unlike justice, we're not blind, we all have eyes. You call it justice, but it's just another word for jive. Now, Mrs. Bush, justice had to have been deaf, mute, and blind when you have created No Child Left Behind. You're setting children up for a great big fall. But Mrs. Bush, don't you know that an injustice to one is an injustice to all? Justice should be on the children's side. You call it justice, but even the children call it jive. Where was justice when Katrina went down? Perhaps she was helping old Master keep Swobos. Where was justice when Katrina went down? Perhaps she was hiding out with the FEMA director, that incompetent Michael Brown. The people at the Superdome sent up a prayer and hoped that FEMA would soon be there. But Bush and Brown really didn't care. They wished they all had just floated away while they lied and schemed and created an inexcusable delay. But someone once said that justice delayed is justice denied. You call it justice, but now the whole world can recognize jive. Thank you. I had to do that. Well, I wrote that point, but I had to do this tonight. But like I said, don't invite a poet to a program. But anyway, I'm going to talk about the justice system, and I was listening to what Zoharah said, and I'm going, oh, this is exactly what I'm talking about, because I'm going to go back to 1624. During the Twin Act, this guy named Winthrop Jordan wrote, I don't even know where I read it at now, but where? Black over white, yeah, but I'm still, yeah, anyway, Winthrop Jordan, yeah, black over white, Winthrop Jordan, that was in 1624 when he wrote about the Twin Act. He wrote and he showed where two indentured servants ran off together. One was black and one was white. When they finally caught up with them and captured them, they had to go to court. The white servant got 3 more years tacked on to his indentured servitude. But the black servant was enslaved for the rest of his life. And it's been going on forever and ever and ever in America. We can talk about the justice system when it comes to crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. They have a stiffer sentence for black men that's selling crack cocaine. All of it is poison. But they'll sentence a black man to jail a long time. And white men, whoever the drug dealers are, they're selling powder cocaine, get off sometimes on probation and community service. This still going on. We can talk about the juvenile justice system, because I work with the Juvenile Center for Justice out of Jackson. And it's bad when a country is going to build jail cells around around black boys. If they can't read by the time they're in the 3rd grade, then that's how they building their new jail cells. That's how they estimating how many jail cells they're gonna need in the future. Something is wrong with a country that say they all democratic and you got freedom. And so if one injustice might not affect you, but it's gonna affect the whole community after a while. Because don't think that you are immune to it. It can happen to you anytime and anybody. Like I'm working on a new poem called It's Dangerous Being Black in America. After one of my friends got kicked by a deputy, he wasn't a deputy, he was an auxiliary sheriff out at the Bolivar County Correctional Facility. Now, the last time I talked to anybody, it was against the law to put your hands on a law enforcement officer. Well, my friend was a law enforcement officer on duty at the rifle range. And this auxiliary, he wasn't even a sheriff. He walked up to him and kicked him. Went to court, they found him innocent, and he told the court, oh, he didn't kick him, he tapped him. And I'm going, he too dumb to know the difference between a tap and a kick? You tap people with your hands and you kick them with your feet, but he got away with it. And then they hired him. I found out the other day that they hired him as a sheriff because they fired my friend, the victim. They fired the victim and hired the perpetrator. That's why I'm talking about justice and the justice system in America everywhere I go now. I can talk about how they mistreat prisoners. Prisoners have rights, they're human beings. I don't care where you are, if you're in Parchment, Rankin County, up there in Kankakee or wherever, you have a right to be treated with dignity. They don't do that. They look at them like they animals. They say they commodities, and they say they're commodities. And they just human resources. That's what they call them, human resources. And this is how they resourcing and recycling us. They take you from the time you're in elementary school and tag you as a bad kid or whatever. You might just not get the method that the teacher is teaching. You might have to change your method. You might have to find a way to work one-on-one with that child until he understands what you're saying. But they don't do that. They just say, oh, well, we're going to send him to the detention center. And then next year, maybe he'll go on out to McGrimmett's place. That's county jail. And then the next step is going over to Parchment. They keep the police employed. They're using us as him like we were enslaved, where we still are, because they're keeping the police employed by having to arrest them and harass them. Then they're keeping the guards employed, because they gotta keep watch over them when they go to jail. Then when they get out of jail, they're keeping the probation officers employed. So that's why I said we're human fodder, and it's up to us, adults, to take a stand and say we are going to save our children. Because I'm very passionate about young people, and especially about young black men, because they're getting a bad deal, like they always have. I know somebody told me one time I was speaking in wherever, but they told me I sound angry. Well, I am. Well, I be gone a lot, but I don't, I was somewhere, maybe in Cincinnati, wherever. But anyway, they told me I sound angry. A black lady walked up to me and told me I sound angry. And I'm going, well, damn, when are you gonna get angry? When are you gonna get angry? Because if we stand up and don't do anything, we can do stuff. We can take charge of our own communities. We can start community centers. We can do whatever it takes. If you see a kid that's going astray, some of these kids you can't talk to, and I'm conceding that. But try to help him. Try to tell him, I know something else you can do that's interesting and it's fun, and you won't go to jail. And then we can talk about the justice system to them and let them know that they want you to act like this. They planning on it. That's why they have teaching children now, because they planning on filling those jail cells. Why are they building jail cells, more jails? They building jails in Washington County. We got a brand new jail out there at the correctional facility. They got to build a women's prison out there. Why aren't they building any new schools? The school that I went to, and my cousin Vaughn and my friends back there, Bay and Zenovia, we went to this school. It was, well, when Vaughn and I went there, it was called Cleveland Color Consolidated School. Well, my cousins went there before I did, and they were way older than me. The school is so raggedy, they got asbestos and mold and mildew in it. The Justice Department has already told them that they got to get a new facility, but they running around talking about they don't have any money. Well, take some of that money from the jail, what you build it, and build a new school. They built a new school for, what is that, Von? That's H.R. Walter Robinson Achievement Center. But that's just another word of saying it's a detention center for kids when they misbehave in school. That's all it is. But they could build a new center for kids that's misbehaving instead of training teachers how to handle kids. I've taught in San Francisco, in the ghetto, in the inner city. And you can control children there. These kids are good kids down here, trust me, because I know bad kids when I see them. And if you can take kids in the ghetto and in the inner city and change them and make them star students, why can't these teachers do it down here? And that's all I have to say, because I want to hear my godson speak.
Okay, how y'all doing this evening? I apologize for being a little late. It's bad weather in South Mississippi. Coming up there was just, really slow traffic, and I actually like driving in the rain, but turns out most people don't. And, it was the speed limit or slower all the way up, so I apologize for the lateness of it. But then was happy when I got to the Delta and saw the sun shining. I mean, it was almost 7 o'clock and the sun was still shining. I'm actually from Yazoo City, and so this is home to me, and I always like coming to visit my godmother, mentor, teacher, friend, supporter, and, somebody I can call when I'm having problems and I can, kind of complain and cry to. So I'm happy to be here for lots of reasons, but I want to talk to you about two different subjects, one of which is that my book is going around. It's on the history of the Black Panther Party, and I'll talk to you just briefly, because I know we want to have a dialogue about a new project I'm working on. So again, I appreciate you all being here and appreciate the Deltas for sponsoring this. From a brother that's an Omega, thank you all so much. The Black Panther Party is really connected with everything you've sort of heard on the panel, from Dr. Jeffries' Bloody Lowndes, to what was going on in Claiborne County, definitely to what was going on in Laurel, and certainly what SNCC was doing here with Sam Block and Margaret Block and Kwame Ture and a whole bunch of other people, because in October of 1966 in Oakland, California, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale started what they called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. But in fact, they had gotten the name and the political ideology from the Lowndes County Freedom Organization. In Oakland, California, there was widespread unemployment, widespread mistreatment, police brutality, and murder of Black people. The schools were just as bad in Oakland as they were in Cleveland or even Yazoo City, where I grew up. And so Blacks had moved in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s for these great opportunities up north and out west, but what they found was more of the same. And so these people came along, again, borrowing from what people had done in places like Mississippi and Alabama, and tried to superimpose that kind of political activism on what was going on in Oakland. And let me just say that in the 6 weeks prior to October '66, when the Panthers got started, 7 Black people had been murdered in the Oakland Bay Area. That includes Richmond, Vallejo, San Francisco, and Oakland. And all 7 of these individuals' deaths had been deemed by the coroner justifiable homicides, including one 16-year-old who was shot in the back 6 times. They found that to be justifiable. So one of the things that you'll probably get to, Dr. Jeffries, in the discussion is that the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, in addition to registering people to vote, often carried arms. And that's why they were able to, that's one of the reasons why they were able to get so many people to vote. I know Medgar Evers and his brother Charles, when they came back from having fought in World War II, went down to the courthouse in Kemper County to register to vote. And the registrar told them, they don't let Black people vote. Of course, they didn't use the word Black. And they actually came back the next day with their Army issue 45s to vote, and they became the first 2 black people in Kemper County to register to vote. Nobody got shot, nothing happened other than they got their name signed on this list. And so the Black Panther Party sort of takes a note from that book, and they decide that we're going to end this police brutality and all these other problems that are happening in our community. And one of the things that they did that brought them the kind of attention that they got was to follow the police. For those of you who are history majors, and perhaps you've just read about it or heard about it, but in 1965, after the Voting Rights Act was passed, after things got hot and heavy down in Mississippi and Alabama, there was a riot, or should I say a rebellion, in Los Angeles. It becomes known as the Watts riot, but actually, if you're able to check my book out or any other sources, what you'll find is there were actually about 80 other cities that caught on fire at the same time, including Pasadena and Hollywood. So it wasn't just something that went on in Watts, which is the black section of Los Angeles, South Central LA. And this rebellion happened because of an incident of police brutality. So the Panthers come along and decide, in order to stop police brutality, what we're going to do is fight fire with fire. So they decided that they were going to follow the police around their communities with cameras, with recording equipment, and more importantly, with arms, with guns. And they had been trained very well because there were people in organizations, again, that come out of places like Mississippi and Alabama, like the Black United Front, the Deacons for Defense and Justice. There's a group in the county where I grew up in, down in Claiborne County, called the Spirit, which was a group but wasn't really a group. But all of these were armed organizations that were keeping people safe from harm. And what they found is when they did this, people, when they started in '68, there was no Miranda law. That didn't come along, when they started in '66. Miranda didn't come along until '68, but when the Panthers started watching the police in Oakland and San Francisco arrest people from a distance with their guns, they noticed that they didn't get brutalized. They noticed that they were given proper bail. And so this was sort of a victory in their minds. And what we begin to see is that in the 6 months that the Panthers are in existence in Oakland, late 1966, early 1967, all the police brutality disappears. I talked to you about those 7 people that died prior to that. No more dead black men in this short period of time. And so people were catching on, hey, this is a pretty good group of individuals. Problem was most people were afraid to join. I mean, you think about what you've heard here, and you think about the psyche of a black person in the mid to late 1960s and what that individual, whether they're parents or, coming of age as teenagers and young adults, you sort of feel a certain way and you think a certain way. And one of the things that you really don't do is to challenge authority, whether that authority is black or white. And so there was some reluctance to join. However, in May of 1967, there was an incident in Richmond where another person was killed, and the family called the Black Panther Party. And the Black Panther Party showed up, and the sheriff said, well, that's a justifiable homicide. If you're interested in doing anything about it, you need to go talk to your congressman. And this is exactly what they decided to do, is to go up to Sacramento to talk with their elected official, who was actually, in addition, to being their elected official, pushing through the California legislature a law that would ban the Panthers or anybody else from carrying weapons in the open, anybody else except police officers. It would eventually come to be known as the Mulford Act. Don Mulford was their assemblyman. So they drive to Sacramento, and Ronald Reagan, who you know as president, well, he was governor at the time of California. And so you got about 10 to 12 vehicles full of black men and women coming up to the State House. And when they pull up to the State House, Ronald Reagan is on the front lawn talking to a group of young children. I think it's a 4-H club. And, there's a group of reporters and there's a camera people out there. But the law in California said that you couldn't, have loaded weapons in your vehicle. So they pull in front of the State House and all these, 30 people with their black leather jackets and their berets tipped to the side, black pants, get out of the cars, and they start jacking rounds into the chambers. And Ronald Reagan is watching this, and he just sort of takes off. He's not going to stay around. He's not going to help the kids. He's not going to protect them. He's gone. He's not walking fast. He's not jogging. He takes off. But what's important about that is that the cameras then follow the children who come up to the Panthers and go, nice 30-06, mister, can I hold it? And so here's Bobby Seale letting this young kid hold his shotgun, asking him, where is the assembly room? Of course, the kid has no idea where the assembly room is, but the camera then follows him inside of the State House. And they eventually get to almost to where they want to be. And somebody actually, because they're afraid of all these black people with guns, direct them into the wrong door. So rather than going into the viewing gallery, which every state house in the nation has, where you can go and watch the political process unfold, they actually wind up on the assembly floor. Now, the California Assembly is all white with the exception of one black male. And you can imagine how they felt when all these black people walked into their, place of work with all these guns. If you have the book, the first line in it is one of my favorite lines, and I hope you're not that sensitive. But, in unison, all these legislators say, who in the hell are these niggas with these guns? And, they don't wait around for an answer. They leave too, So I tell you that story because I told you that most people were afraid to join the party. Well, all of this is being filmed. And it gets on the 6 o'clock news in Oakland and San Francisco, and then it spreads down to LA. And then other news bureaus pick it up across the country. And almost overnight, the Black Panther Party goes from this organization with 20 or 30 people to one with thousands of people in it. And turns out that law that was being pushed through the legislature got passed that day, because they were just not interested in seeing that happen again. Very popular because they stand on their principle of self-defense, but also, and you were talking about, doing your own thing, also building their communities. They started things like the free breakfast program. And if you were like me, I said I grew up in Yazoo City, a lot of times, I felt like my mom was sending me to school to eat, because we were so poor. I wound up learning something, but we didn't have any food at home, but they had these free lunches and free breakfasts. Well, they got that because the Black Panther Party started the free breakfast program, and in order to keep people from joining the party, the government started its own free breakfast programs in school. I mean, what they realized is that kids were a lot more likely to learn English and math and history if they weren't starving, if they weren't hungry. And so they saw their grades go up dramatically after they started feeding the kids. They saw these issues with health in their communities. And so they recruited medical students, and they recruited doctors, and they opened their own free health clinics. And if you're like me, you're growing up rather poor, you went to the health department where you could get free health care. Well, the government starts this because the Panthers free health clinics become so popular. And they're not just treating the common cold, they're treating real diseases. In fact, they start the Sickle Cell Anemia Research Foundation, which Richard Nixon mentions in his State of the Union address. And sickle cell anemia is a disease that mostly affects black people. And doctors knew this for a very long time, but they weren't doing anything about it. It's a blood disease that is really meant to fight malaria. If you're growing up and living in Africa, over thousands of years, your genetic structure kind of changes so you can fight malaria because there are no mosquito trucks to go around and spray stuff. And some of y'all know what mosquito trucks are. Well, if there's no malaria to fight and you got that trait, then it's very painful. It becomes a disease. And that's kind of what happened to black people in this country. And the Panthers began to research this disease. And now today, people don't die. Well, a lot of people that, have the disease aren't dying from it. It can be treated. So they did things like that. They started their own schools. So the Black Panther Party didn't wait around to see what the government would do for them. Even though they complained and yelled and screamed and talked about all that was wrong, they did build their own schools, their own health clinics. I talked about the free breakfast programs, but the thing that sort of brought them their demise was the thing that got them started. This whole notion of we're going to fight fire with fire. You can kind of guess how the police started to feel after a while, after being trail by black men and women with guns. I'm sure you can guess that, and if you can't, just imagine yourself being trailed by anybody with guns. So you've heard of the SWAT team, for example. The SWAT team is developed in an effort to get rid of the Black Panther Party through this government program called the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO, where first they really create these cells of people who, for the most part, are coming back from Vietnam, have combat experience, have explosives experience to deal with the Black Panther Party, because many of them have come back from Vietnam, couldn't find a job, and so they joined the Black Panther Party. And so you have these two groups that are offsetting each other. And there are all these shootouts in Chicago and New York and LA, and people like Bunchy Carter gets killed on the campus of UCLA in 1968. Fred Hampton on December 4th of 1969 gets killed 4 o'clock in the morning. A team of FBI gang intelligence units and Chicago police officers come into his house after, by the way, he's been drugged by an informant, and shoots up the entire apartment and kills him and the person who's guarding the door. So, while they did all of these good things, their strategy and tactics have to be questioned. And that's what I write about in my book. I talk about their legacy, their very positive legacy, but I also talk about how to organize, and I kind of reflect back on what happened in Lowndes County and what happened in Claiborne County and what happened here in Cleveland, because it seems that when people get together, when they realize what their problems are, when they work with their neighbors, whether their neighbors are rich or poor, black or white, usually the gains are much more long-term. And that's the issue I'm trying to get across in the history of the Black Panther Party in my book, Up Against the Wall. And so I know we're running out of time here, so I'll just take maybe 3 minutes, Paul, if that's okay, to talk about this new project. As was mentioned, I'm teaching at the University of Southern Mississippi, and I doubt if most of you know that the University of Southern Mississippi has a population that's 30% black. It's the only school in the entire United States, only traditionally white school in the entire United States who has a black population, or that has a black population that high. However, there is still sort of this feeling that, that might be a problem. There's no support, for example, for anything having to do with black studies. And this is systemic and this is historical. So this new project I'm working on is this biography about this guy named Clyde Kennard. And I am going to wrap up here. Clyde Kennard tried to integrate the University of Southern Mississippi, which was then Mississippi Southern College, in 1957, again in 1958, again in 1959. Kennard had gone to Korea. He had fought in World War II. He was a paratrooper. He used his GI Bill benefits. He's from Hattiesburg, by the way. Used his GI Bill benefits to go to start working on a degree in political science at the University of Chicago. And he does that for about 3 years until his stepfather falls ill in Hattiesburg. And he has to leave Chicago and come back to Mississippi to help work this, I think it's like a 200-acre farm. They get pigs and chickens and cows and corn and cotton and whatnot. His mother couldn't work alone. So he came back to help. Well, he figures, I was at the University of Chicago, I was doing really well, I'll just finish my schooling up. I got 1 more year, I'll just finish. Well, the University of Southern Mississippi says, wait, And he actually waited. He waited until 1958 and comes back and they says, well, we're still not quite ready yet. Keep in mind, Brown has just been passed, as has Brown 2, which comes out and says you got to do that with all deliberate speed. So he understands. But the third time he attempts to register, he goes to campus to meet with the president of the university, who he's been corresponding with over the phone and through the mail. But while he's inside the office of the president, William David McCain, the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission, local authorities from Forest County, and some school officials plant liquor in his car. And of course, at this time, Mississippi is a dry state. And certainly, Forest is a dry county. So he comes out of the meeting, leaves, and is immediately stopped by the police. They search his car, and of course, they find liquor. So he gets taken to jail and fined $600. Now, $600 is a lot of money today. And you can imagine what it was worth in 1959. Well, he didn't stop trying to integrate this university. He tried one more time, and what they decided to do, they being the State Sovereignty Commission, local officials, and people on the campus there, is to frame him and send him to jail. And this is exactly what they did. They had a young man by the name of Johnny Lee Roberts, an illiterate 19-year-old black man, to steal chicken feed from a local co-op and then plant it on Kennard's family's farm. So they go out to his farm, they find these 2 bags of stolen chicken feed, and they charge him with burglary and theft of the co-op. They bring him to the Forest County Court, and an all-white jury in 22 minutes try him and find him guilty and sentence him to 7 years hard labor in Parchman Penitentiary. So 1960, he comes to Parchman, starts serving this sentence, is, worked to the point of exhaustion, has all kinds of trouble. 3 years into his sentence, he either contracts a disease. There are some people who say he's poisoned. I mean, I'm just now doing the research. I don't know what happened to him. In any case, he becomes deathly ill, and he gets operated on at the University of Mississippi down in Jackson. Nothing comes of that. Still being dragged from his bed out into the fields and forced to pick cotton. Well, eventually this young white kid from Brandeis, who's dropped out of school and come to Mississippi to help work in the movement, hears about this, writes a story about it, and the AP picks it up. And just like with what went on with the Emmett Till incident, people are outraged at what's going on. And so the governor, after all of this outrage, does allow Kennard to leave prison. But not long after that, he dies back up in Chicago. And so I'm writing this story because there is still that legacy of intransigence and hate, not just at the university where I work, but in the environment in which I live. And I believe that Kennard, who always wanted to work with people, he was an officer in the NAACP and refused to have the NAACP make this a political issue. He simply wanted to go to school. He didn't want to become, an activist. Of course he was registering people to vote, but he didn't want to make a big deal out of it, in other words. And so I'm working on this new project so that I can get people to see that unless we work together and talk with each other and deal with each other on a basis where honesty and integrity is paramount, then we're going to keep getting more of the same. We're going to keep getting great poetry like the sister just gave us. We're going to keep getting not just history books like Dr. Jeffries has written and like Dr. Crosby has written, but we're going to continue to live that history. And I don't have to tell you about that for those of you who live in the Delta. I don't presume that everybody who goes to Delta State is from the Delta, but I don't have to tell you about some of the problems. And I know that the only way to solve those problems is through dialogue. And so having said that, welcome any questions or comments you have about anything I said, and of course, about what the other panelists have said here tonight. Thank you very much.
We want to transition to question and answer period. I do want to just say a few things. It seems to me that the panelists in many ways spoke about distinctive, unique topics, but there was a lot of connection between what you all were saying. And I think both the importance of history, the importance of organizing, community organizing, the role that ordinary people can play in politics. And I think this is something that we often forget today, that the civil rights movement was a movement of so-called ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And too often, I think, we often think of the civil rights movement as kind of a middle-class movement. But in many ways, what we're getting here in these new interpretations is the civil rights movement as a working-class movement. I mean, certainly what scholars like Charles Payne and others have shown us. The other thing I'll add real briefly is that my wife and I were just in Trinidad doing research on C.L.R. James. And those of you who are familiar with Pan-Africanism, international anti-colonialism know that name. One of the things we found in Trinidad, we were there during Emancipation Day. Trinidad is the only nation on the face of the earth that celebrates the abolition of slavery as a national holiday. It's an entire weekend of events. The National Emancipation Committee has made it their top priority to rename one of the major thoroughfares in the Port of Spain, which is the largest city of Trinidad, after Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture. And so here I was, a US citizen down in Trinidad, and hearing all these people talk about Stokely. It was very interesting, and a reminder that the civil rights movement had a tremendous international impact, both in terms of what people learned about it in places like Trinidad or Asia or Africa, but also it drew from international currents and trends in anti-colonialism and Pan-Africanism. So I just wanted to add those few thoughts. But again, wonderful presentations, and now let's kind of open it up to questions and dialogue. Those of you who may have a question. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I wanted to ask the fellow that just finished, then the white people began to turn the pamphlets against each other, that what separated them.
There was some of that through the counterintelligence program where people were, in fact, turned against each other. They would write, for example, a letter saying, you know, I'm going to kill you, or hey, so-and-so is cheating with your wife. And if you are a part of this movement, you're already paranoid, right? You don't know what's going to happen to you the next day. So part of the counterintelligence program did in fact work to create factionalism inside the party, and they were quite successful at doing that. And in fact, Huey Newton and the people who supported him versus the people who supported Eldridge Cleaver, at one point, when you look at what's going on in San Francisco and New York, are actually shooting at each other because of this factionalism. So you're absolutely right about that.
And also, were they giving them drugs?
There's that allegation. I don't have proof of that, but you know, Huey Newton did become addicted to drugs. Whether people were giving them to him or whether he was buying them for himself is unclear to me. But that did become a problem.
So the group was doing very good until they contaminated, right?
The group was doing very good. In fact, much of what I wrote is based on oral histories. I mean, I did go into the archives. I did read a bunch of newspapers, government documents, police records. But a lot of people say the party would have been fine if Huey Newton had just stayed in jail, you know. So that's kind of the sentiment, that things were going along fine until this certain point. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Could either one of you, if you know, explain to me the composition of the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission in the early 60s? Who did that committee compose? I knew the governor was of here, but what was the composition of that committee?
It was the governor, because I'm a victim of them. It was the governor, the highway patrol, the state senate, and don't get it wrong, it was not just Mississippians, it was like the Pioneer Fund out of New York, and some big firms, I forgot, Shatterfield, some big firms out of New York and insurance companies were supporting the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission. So it was all of the entities that represented Mississippi as governed, you know, the governing entities of Mississippi.
Let me clarify a little better. In reference to Bolivar County, do you know how Bolivar County was tied into the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission during the 60s?
Yeah.
The 50s and the 60s?
Well, they had, you can go online and read all of that, but then they had the sheriff of Bolivar County, and the white citizens councils of Bolivar County, and then they had informants. I used to call them snitches, but I got proper and I started calling them informants. So they had informants. People would inform on, just come to a meeting so they can run back and tell Sheriff Capps or whatever. I think it was, I don't remember who it was at that time. But they would inform on us. And I don't want to be specific and call no names, but you know who they are. One of them is my uncle. And one of them was a preacher. Two of them are preachers, and God only knows who else it was.
And she's absolutely right about where you can get this information. I do teach Mississippi history, and you know, if that were something I was doing this semester, I would remember. I don't remember the proper names, but the Mississippi Department of Archives and History has done an excellent job of assembling the records of the State Sovereignty Commission. And for those of you who are unaware of what that is, it was sort of like the FBI in Mississippi, except it was constituted to prevent the integration of public life and to prevent the success of the civil rights movement. So, as has been pointed out, not only would there be informants who would go and relay information, but there would be, you know, real concerted action to prevent people from registering people to vote, from integrating a school. You know, things like firing people from their jobs. Most people, as you know, or as you can probably guess, rented. You know, they lived on plantation. They worked by shares. So you could easily get kicked off your land if you're talking that freedom talk, that civil rights stuff. And these are the kinds of things that the Sovereignty Commission, along with the White Citizens Council, were involved in. And if you just Google MDAH and do a subject search of any name, you'll find it. I mean, I spend, when I can't sleep, that's what I do. I go to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History website, and I just read stuff until I can't read anymore. Much of what I've learned about Clyde Kennard, in fact, came from that particular website. So I'd encourage you to check that out.
And I think you can even do it by county. I mean, I think you can even, you know, so do Bolivar, search by Bolivar County and get that.
I had it Bolivar County. You said it in the clear list, Bolivar County won't touch it.
I meant you can,
What was the?
MDAH is short for the Mississippi Department of Archives, Archives and History.
and when you're at their website, in the Sovereignty Commission papers, you can select Bolivar County as a search.
Yes, ma'am.
Also though, for the Mississippi Department, I mean, for the Sovereignty Commission things, which I've spent a few hours in myself, anybody from here in Bolivar County, Ames and Moore has, I mean, that'll keep you busy for the rest of the year. And his start earlier than any I've seen. I mean, his Sovereignty Commission class starts around 57, 58, or 59.
Right.
Whereas a lot of the rest of us didn't start until the 60s.
Yeah.
And you'll even find things where a lot of it is asinine stuff. I mean, I saw him go into this meeting and all this kind of stuff. Or they get lazy and they just print somebody else's newsletter. But they are busy worrying about where people are going on Christmas Eve. You know,
Yeah.
They have nothing else better to do. But if you wanted to start with Bolivar County, MC Moore is an excellent name for.
As if is my brother Sam.
Yeah, he's got.
Because when they first opened up the files, that Sam was in that 6th percentile that they didn't want to release the files on because ACLU was suing them. And I mean, you can look a lot of people up, people that didn't even have an idea, just talking to us. Is in there.
Yes, sir.
And also, the History Channel has produced a very good documentary on the Sovereignty Commission.
Really?
And all the things.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Mississippi State Secrets. I'm like you, Dr. Olson. I find the Sovereignty Commission website to be pretty addictive.
Mississippi State Secrets.
It's very good, very well
Check
done.
that out.
Other questions, comments, perhaps from students as well? We're all students of history, right? But,
Right.
Sorry, in what direction do you think the movement is heading in? For students, you know, my age, kind of, you know, getting close to graduating or whatever, what is there to do for maybe people in my position at a university? You know, where is it heading? How far do you think it has to go from here? Kind of just broad, general questions like that I have.
Am I?
Everybody looking at us.
That's a great question.
Yeah.
It's a great
It
question.
sure is.
And I'll just say in brief, it'll go wherever you take it. And that's just not, I'm not just being flip. I mean, there's so many issues. I mean, there's so many problems that have to be addressed, that need to be addressed. If you zero in on one that you are passionate about, I mean, that's the place to start. And then that's the place to begin sort of the wheels of motion. And so, you know, on campuses, I mean, you know, sometimes our college campuses are unique environments into and of themselves. And there are sort of campus issues, and there are community issues, and then there are national issues, and then there are international issues. I mean, so whatever it is that you are passionate about is the place to begin. Because it is a certain passion that is required to sustain the energy and momentum to maintain the commitment, because victories are far and few between, and they come in odd shapes and sizes, and sometimes you don't even recognize it. And so it's that passion to make a difference, to make change, that is really required. But the issue is what you want to organize around. And if you're organizing a community, I mean, one of the lessons that comes out of SNCC, I mean, it's so valuable to study them, is that they didn't tell people what to organize around if they went into a community. They asked the community, well, what issues is it? What issues are there on the ground that the community wants to address, and then you build around there. So one is, well, what do you want to do? And you can start building momentum around that. And the other is, if you want to go in a community and help a community, then you go in and say, what is it that the community wants? And then begin to build momentum around that.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, we have one of these. One of our big problems is literacy, for example. I read a couple of years ago, I can't remember where, but the average high school graduate in Mississippi, according to this article, graduates with the same skill level as a sharecropper in 1955. I mean, the literacy rate in our state is abysmal. Today was the first day of class, Paul, which is why I couldn't miss. And what I always do on the first day of class is find out how well my students write. First of all, so I can know what I'm dealing with, but also so, halfway down the road, I get this great paper. I know that, they didn't write it. And every time, I find out that, here I have, some people who have clearly graduated from high school that can't put a paragraph together. And so there's an issue that you can deal with. One of the things that I work on in Hattiesburg, we just opened a technology center. We realize that there's a technology gap in this country, and particularly in our state. And I know very little about computers, but I have friends in the College of Science and Technology. I have students who are very proficient, not just with Facebook and email, but with everything. So I get them to volunteer to go out to the community and try to narrow this technology gap, because I'm interested in working with kids. And so I think Dr. Jeffries is absolutely right. It really is based on you and how you feel, and not, maybe this thing on TV or this thing these people are doing looks sexy or it looks cool to be a part of. But without the kind of commitment and passion that it takes, you get in and become bored really quickly. So you have to decide, I believe, what it is you're willing to stick with, and then carry it on until you can't carry it on. And that's how we got to where we are today. I mean, I don't teach at the University of Southern Mississippi because I'm cool or because I'm smart. I teach there because a lot of people died and went to jail first so that we could go there, but then so that we could have the opportunity to work wherever it is we were, qualified to work. And I realize that people make major sacrifices. And so these aren't just people that I write about. These aren't just people that I think about in abstract terms. I'm actually living what it was people fought for. And so, as he pointed out, you might not even feel what you're doing is a victory. I'm sure that person who went to jail 50 times thought, man, Stokely said he wasn't going to jail no more. But now look how far we've come, and it goes to the latter part of your question, how much further we have to go. We still have a ways to go, but it's clear that if people get together, we can go a lot farther than if we did it just as individuals.
And if I could just also add that all of these issues are connected. I mean, if you begin, education is connected, or poor quality schools is connected to high unemployment, which is connected to poor healthcare, inadequate access to healthcare, which is connected to poor housing, connected to crime and violence. So no matter where you begin, I mean, it's a spider web, and it's all interconnected, and so there's no wrong place to begin. But that's why maintaining that, or finding something that you're passionate about that can sustain your interest over time is so important.
Yes, sir, in the back.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak to one of my passions, and that is
like Sade.
one that deals with truth and reconciliation. And in any relationship, in any healthy relationship, when wrong has been done, that you apologize, if you're sincere, and if you would like healing to truly begin. So I would, as my preface, I would just like to get feeling our remarks from the panel about what do you feel about official apology from the state of Mississippi for the egregious acts that have happened in the past.
I didn't know if you were fidgety one.
I'll start by, I don't remember it well enough, but Professor John Hope Franklin wrote an article, "Apologies Are Not Enough," and I think he was talking specifically about the Tulsa race riots that directly affected his family. But so he talked in that article about the fact that there is something important and significant about acknowledging wrongs, but that it's only a starting place, and that without being part of a broader attempt to grapple with the implications and deal with the implications, it's not enough. And so I guess what he was suggesting is it wasn't something he would dismiss, but he didn't think it by itself was sufficient, and I find that a really compelling way to think about it.
Well, me being the victim, I truth and reconciliation, but who's gonna do the reconciling? Because I don't have any problem except, let me rephrase that. I don't have a reason to reconcile with anybody because I never harmed anybody. I was a victim. And I'm interested in truth and reconciliation if we can get the truth. And if they will reconcile, I don't understand how you're gonna reconcile with the victims, no how. But I'm for reparations. That's my, they really need to talk about reparations. And we can talk about reconciliation when we talk about, I'm forever the poet, when we talk about reparations. And truth, what truth are they going to tell? Are we expected to be apologetic to them for being black and causing trouble for them? That's why I was working on the Truth Project at the Ole Miss, but I kind of got like, wait a minute, I don't have a reason to apologize to nobody. And I don't. And so they should, we need to talk about it, but we need to re-examine that word reconciliation. Because I don't feel like I got to apologize or reconcile or nothing with nobody.
Just for clarification, I definitely was not talking about African Americans apologizing.
I know, but that's how it's ending up. That's the side that I'm getting from some organizations that I had tried to work with.
Okay. I would just add to that.
And hey, Sade.
Hey,
We do need some truth telling. That's what we all do as historians. Mm-hmm. And while we're engaged in these oral history projects to get the truth out, to uncover and unearth truths that have been buried and that people want to keep silent. So we do need truth telling at a lot of different levels. And it's not just the state government of Mississippi. I have a long list of people who need to apologize to black folk in America and throughout the world. And Mississippi is high on the list, but it's not just the state. It's counties. County governments need to apologize. Municipalities need to apologize for the treatment and mistreatment of people of color, dispossession and disenfranchisement. The national government is not just southern states, it's northern states. I got a long list that we can have lunch over and discuss. But then they also need to back it up, because an apology is simply saying sorry empty-handed without anything behind it. This is just in the question of reparations. Really means nothing. Congress, most recently, the House of Representatives passed a resolution apologizing for slavery. No, was it Jimmy? Segregation. Yeah. They apologizing for some shit, but they ain't back it up with any money. And what they did in it, but this is the serious aspect of it. Yeah. What they said is, we apologize, but this does not, and here the clause, this does not mean that we are liable for any, or this has no legal standing in a courtroom or court of law. We don't owe you anything, and this was the way it got passed. because unanimously, and you had a couple people who stood on the sidelines, because otherwise, Mississippi congressional delegation, Alabama congressional delegation, South Carolina congressional delegation said, we don't want to have any parts of it unless you put in that this apology ain't really an apology because we don't owe you anything because we apologizing for what we did to you. But don't take it that way. So, that's empty. Until we can get to the point where we can talk about the truth and then say, it's not about cutting a check to a person, but saying, let's invest in improving and making life chances better for everybody who still suffers from the problems that the nation as a whole created. And that's where we need to get, and that's where we're not at the moment.
I think just to add briefly, one of the things that we have to understand is if we want the truth, we have to search for it and seek for it and find it ourselves. Florida had the highest per capita lynching rate in the United States, higher than Mississippi. And it's a state that I will periodically do research on. For the first time in the history of a particular city, which was an all-white town after a massacre of African Americans, this town I'm talking about is Ocoee, Florida, in Orange County. They've recently invited me to come down and give a talk about the Ocoee race riot. Now, this is the first time in the history of this city that they've actually acknowledged that they massacred black people for simply trying to vote on Election Day 1920. But it's an example of how the truth always comes with the struggle. And I mentioned earlier Trinidad. It was striking for me to be in a country where the entire weekend was reserved for the examination of the abolition of slavery, how it came about, what had happened after that period. The history of colonialism in Trinidad was especially brutal, involving a lot of exploitation. And there was a space to talk about these things. And it reminded me that today we have small spaces that we could make larger. We have celebrations. We have commemorations of Martin Luther King Jr. I'm very dissatisfied with many of the celebrations and commemorations that I have participated with, because I think that they are too milquetoasty. I don't know if that metaphor means anything. What it means is they're too watered down. Too often these celebrations take Dr. King's legacy and just water it down, waste time. Don't talk about SNP. Don't talk about CORE. Don't talk about community organizing. Don't talk about how to change things today. So I think it's incumbent upon us to search for truth and to use the spaces that we do have and to enlarge those. Yes, sir.
All this, using the phrase truth-telling and truth and reconciliation prompted me to speak up. And we done a lady at the back who brought up about Bolivar County and Simon. You're right, I'm nervous. I'm not as good as Mike. But in Bolivar County, well, here at Delta State, there's a building right over there named after Charlie Capps. Now, how many people know that Charlie Capps was the president of East Bolivar County White Citizens Council? How many people know that he was president of the Mississippi Sheriff's Association in 1964? How many people know that in December of 1964, after the Neshoba County Sheriff Lawrence Ray was arrested, that Charlie Capps, as president of the Mississippi Sheriff's Association, asked for the association to support the Neshoba County Sheriff Lawrence Ray? How many know that when Charlie Capps was sheriff in Bolivar County, there was a black man killed in Mountain Bayou in 1965? Many people view that killing as in effect being a lynch mob that went up there and killed that young black man. And if you go into the Sovereignty Commission file, be sure to look up Charlie Capps. Now, this ties into the present aspect of the unfinished work of the Civil Rights Movement. And Charlie Capps retired from Mississippi State Legislature in 2003. He was considered one of the top 3 most powerful legislators in the state of Mississippi. Some people said he was number 1. That's 2003. At 2003, there was not a single state dollar that went for direct support of early childhood education in the state of Mississippi. They couldn't find $1. But they could find tens of millions of new dollars for more prisons and more beds in those prisons. So there's all kind of ways you can tie this together, the past running right to the right to right. And these, this truth-telling really needs to be told. Without truth, there can be no reconciliation. Actually, without truth and justice, there can be no reconciliation. That's my opinion.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
With problems so prevalent in our society, especially here at the Delta, why is it that you think we're so complacent and we won't get together as a people? And white people know more about Black history than Black people. Why is it that is?
I'm the only Deltan up here. Because I can't answer that. That's a lifelong mystery. I can't I'm the only Bolivar County in Delta. Well, you from the Delta, but I can't answer, but my
In
friend Bill
psychology,
can.
they call it learned helplessness. You've tried so hard to win, and you keep getting pushed back. This happens in corporate structures, and you basically give up hope. And I think that's probably what happens to a lot of people.
Roe, does it happen in universities?
It happens at the university. Very, very likely to happen at the university.
Do they talk about what the remedy for that learned helplessness?
Input, positive input, being part of the show.
Okay. Okay, I think I support that. What I was gonna say, I think maybe that goes alongside that, is fear. I mean, back to the whole truth part, we don't like to say it, and when I'm saying we, I mean Black people, particularly Black men in particular, but a lot of Black people are just scared of white people. There's no real reason for it. I don't think there's any really good reason for it, but I think it's the truth. When I go and I deal with my friends and my relatives and my neighbors, that is the vibe I get, I'm on campus and I come out of meetings and my Black colleagues will say, well, I'm glad you said that, but I never would have said anything like that. And by the way, could you not come by my office anymore? So I think fear has a lot to do with it. And I'm not going to sit here and say to you that the things I do in terms of my community involvement and the things I write about don't cause me a great deal of fear, because it does, but I don't allow it to paralyze me. And I guess that's the input that you're talking about. I can be afraid and still function. I'm well aware that you got one time to die, and that's it. So I'm not waiting around until that time. I'm not gonna disrespect or hurt anybody. I'm gonna do what I feel is right and what I feel is just. And when the end comes, that's just the end. But I believe it has a lot to do with fear, and I guess the technical term is learned helplessness.
And we're also suffering from the Willie Lynch syndrome. Y'all know Willie Lynch? Well, you should if you go to college. But anyway, Willie Lynch. I'll explain. Willie Lynch wrote this paper. He spoke at a gathering of slave owners. He came from the Dominican Republic, wasn't he? Or somewhere, Haiti, or wherever he came from, and his topic was how to keep the Black man down, how to keep the slave down. And he was talking about you put the young against the old, the Black light-skinned against the dark-skinned, and you just work it like that. And this is what's going on today. Today it's all about they bourgeois middle classes. I don't know where they get the idea that they middle class, they working, so you got bills like everybody else. But, and then we fighting against each other. We player hating is what the new term is. But it's the same thing for Willie Lynch's player hating. And all of that, and then people just don't have time. We so exhausted trying to keep up with the Jones that we don't have time to try to sit down and come together as a community and work with each other and see what we can do to to better our own community. I'm having trouble with some people over at East Side about my niece, about the major threats. And that's Arlene's doing, yeah, the major threats, the majorettes. They threats, yeah, but why would you send your child to school just to be talking about she go to school because she likes being a majorette? And then, I mean, we got a lot of people with that mentality, and I'm getting frustrated with it. Because why you gonna buy, I was telling you about them buying these kids these long ponytails. Talking about they want those long, all the major threats to have the long ponytails when they marching. Insane. Why you gonna pay $30 for a ponytail? I'm saying this is what's wrong with society today. Why would you pay $30 for your child to wear a ponytail in a parade? And you need to be buying food and toilet paper and staples for your home. There's something wrong, and I don't know, you know, it's something mighty wrong here. That's what Tyrone said. I love that song by Tyrone Davis, called something's mighty wrong here. And what we got to do, I don't know what to do. I'm telling you, I do what I can. I worked with my cousin Vaughn back then, was Zenobia. But we gotta change the parents' mind and stop them from poisoning these children's mind, cause they gonna be the new leaders. And they coming up already with this poison mind that you got to have your nails. Why would you send a 12-year-old kid to a nail salon and get her pay $35 or whatever they charge to get her nails done? Insanity. And that's what's wrong, and we had better check it. What they say, check it before you wreck it. Because that's what's going on.
They say.
Yes, ma'am.
Are you good?
Emphasis that I've noticed that causes race fear in Cleveland is law enforcement and the press.
Yeah.
The newspaper, the bottle commercial, and law enforcement. I'm gonna be frank with you with the bottle commercial. It writes all the bad news about black folks. White news is always happy. I don't get it anymore for that reason.
And me too.
Law enforcement, like she was saying not long ago, how they just pray when they leave the police station early in the morning. They make a dead drive to the east side of Cleveland. The whole police department, maybe one cop would go over this way. But all the patrol cars due east and harassing people trying to go to work. They're harassing people going to work. They're harassing students going to school. And they get in school and about 20 minutes later they coming out of the school with about 10 or 15 of them in the back of cars, taking them to Rosedale, locking them up for a little nothing. Those are the two things, the two most dangerous things that I have encountered since I've been back in Cleveland, and I've been back in 2004. It's the press and the law enforcement. It is not getting any better.
And that's because black citizens in Cleveland have arrived and not understanding history and not understanding who we are as a people and having no knowledge of our history and understanding that we can change things. If you look at the makeup of the city of Cleveland, you look at the makeup of Bolivar County, and the power is in the hand. When you have power and you refuse to use it, then it becomes useless. And that's what's going on here. And with educated black folk, like I said, we have arrived as educated black folk in Cleveland. And we will not stand up against the status quo. Point blank. And that's our biggest problem.
And Bolivar County is 65% black.
Well,
but you wouldn't know that on election day when they go
Sure
to
wouldn't.
vote.
you got time for one
You
more?
understand that you have that political power and where the power lies, right? If you don't understand how the county board of supervisors by the control of the monies in the county. And since the inception of the voting rights and what the Mississippi legislature did after the passage of the voting rights, and with the massive litigation that was came out of the court system, putting political power in your hands. But if you fail to use that political power, then whose responsibility is it? It's incumbent upon those of us who have the knowledge to dispense of this. Because, you know, I am my brother's keeper. To whom much is given, much is required. And it is required of us, but like I say, I've had a lot of people who say that this is not the time to speak out. Right. This is not the time. So I sit down because I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to lose my status in the community, my standing in the community where you don't have a standing in there. And so that's where we are in Bolivar County, the majority black county. And it has been recently that we've gained control of the county board of supervisors in this county. But it took several years of wrestling, trying to get voters out so that we could control. And still don't understand. You look at little cities around the Mississippi Delta that are probably 95% black, and you have one black on the city board of the board of aldermen. Maybe 2 blacks on the school board. If you ever want to see a city in the state of Mississippi, a little town in the state of Mississippi that resembles a developing third world country, you come to Bolivar County, and I'll take you to that little town. And these are the kinds of things that we're dealing with.
I think Professor Jeffries wants to, and then we should wrap it up, I guess, and, right.
Yeah, as we draw to a close, I would just add that the good news is Jesus only needed 12 disciples. The point is, one of the lessons that we learned coming out of the civil rights movement is that it was never a lot of people. I mean, the people who, you can mobilize a lot of people, but the people who were doing the organizing, just as Jesus was a community organizer, it did not take a lot of people, only a handful of people. The lesson is it doesn't take many to make a big difference. If nothing else, whatever the issue is, however you begin to think about mobilizing a community, whatever the issue is, whatever the problem is, it does not take many to make a big difference.
All right, with that, I think, thank you again to the panelists for the presentation. Thank you, Arlene, appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you for being so patient.
Fair share.